Hello, guys. You caught me reading one of my favorite books, Where the Sidewalk Ends by Silverstein. This is actually a book full of poems. And so I started thinking, poetry really is a special kind of writing. So I wanted to share with you today what makes poetry so special. So today I thought we'd talk about what makes a poem a poem. Poetry is created by putting words together in an interesting way to express a feeling or create a mental picture or tell a story or make a sound. Poetry entertains the ears and the eyes. And I can tell you from this book I was reading today by Silverstein, it is very entertaining. A lot of these poems made me laugh out loud. Now, poetry is different than prose. Prose are it's regular writing, like novels or stories or books or articles. Poetry's totally different. It's not written that way. So I thought I'd share with you today what makes it so different. Poems can be found everywhere. They can be found in books, just like the one I showed you by Silverstein. It's a book of poems that just he wrote. You can also find books of poems by different authors. These books are called anthologies. There are many characteristics of poetry, so let's talk about that word, characteristics. Characteristics are features of something or the elements of something. For example, my features or my characteristics are I have brown hair, I have green eyes. So those are some of my characteristics. So poetry also has characteristics, things that make a poem a poem. The first characteristic we're going to talk about is stanzas. A stanza in a poem is like a paragraph in an essay or a novel. It's a group of lines put together and they're separated by a space. So let's look at this poem, Winter Song, by Catherine Mansfield. Rain and wind and rain. Will the summer come again? Rain on houses on the street, wetting all the people's feet. Though they run with might and main, rain and wind and rain. Snow and sleet and snow, will the winter never go? What do beggar children do with no fire to cuddle to? Perhaps with nowhere warm to go? Snow and sleet and snow. Hail and ice and hail, water frozen in the pail. See the robins, brown and red, they are waiting to be fed. Poor dears battling in the gale, hail and ice and hail. So if we look at this poem, how many stanzas do you think it has? Now remember, a stanza is a group of lines that's separated by a space. So if I look at this one, I see one stanza here with a space, the second stanza here with a space, and the third stanza at the bottom. So there are 3 stanzas to this poem. So as you can see, one feature of poetry is that many times they're written in stanzas. Now let's talk about lines in poetry. A line in a poem is like a sentence in a paragraph. Sometimes poets use punctuation to mark the end of a line, and sometimes they don't. So if we look at one of the stanzas from Winter Song, let's see if we can figure out how many lines this stanza has. Rain and wind and rain. Will the summer come again? Rain on houses, on the street, wetting all the people's feet, though they run with might and main. Rain and wind and rain. So how many lines do you see in this stanza? If you said 6, you're correct. And all you have to do is count the lines. And they look like a sentence, but they don't necessarily make a complete thought for each line. So I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines in this stanza. Another characteristic that some poems have is rhyme. This is the repetition of the end sounds of words, and they're called rhyming words. So if you look at this stanza from the same poem, you can see that we've highlighted the rhyming words to show that this poem does have rhyme. Snow and sleet and snow, will the winter never go? What do beggar children do with no fire to cuddle to? Perhaps with nowhere warm to go, snow and sleet and snow. So you can see the first and second lines rhyme, snow and go. The third and fourth lines, do and to. And the fifth and sixth lines, go and snow. So this poem does have rhyme. Repetition is another characteristic that some poems have. Repetition is the repeating of words, lines, or stanzas. And repetition is used sometimes to emphasize a feeling that the author wants you to have or an idea they want you to understand. So if they use repetition, it's probably pretty important. So let's look at this poem by Silverstein called Invitation. If you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer, if you're a pretender, come sit by my fire, for we have some black golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. If you look at the words highlighted in red, you'll notice they are repeating. He's repeating the phrase, if you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher. So that shows that that's very important, or a feeling or an idea he wants you to have. And at the end, he says, come in twice. So he repeats the last line twice. So that must mean he really wants you to come in if you do these things, or he wants to be around you if you do those things. So that's repetition. Some poems are considered free verse or unrhymed verse. That means they don't have any rhyme or rhythm. I know most people think of poems as rhyming, but not all poems rhyme. So let's look at Winter Trees by William Carlos Williams. All the complicated details of the attiring and the disattiring are completed. A liquid moon moves gently among the long branches. Thus, having prepared their buds against a sure winter, the wise trees stand sleeping in the cold. Now, I don't see any rhyming words here, so this is a free verse poem. So some poems do not rhyme. Imagery is another characteristic that poets use. Imagery is when an author uses words and phrases to help the reader imagine with the senses. So you're using your sight, your sound, your touch, taste, and smell to imagine what is happening in the poem. So let's look at an example of a poem that has some imagery. This is Summer by Walter Dean Myers. I like hot days, sweat is what you got days. Bugs buzzing from cousin to cousin. Juices dripping, running and ripping. Catch the one you love days. Birds peeping, old men sleeping. Lazy days, daisies lay. Beaming and dreaming of hot days, sweat is what you got days. And I also see some of our other characteristics here. I see there's 2 stanzas. I see there's 6 lines in each stanza. I see some rhyming words and also some repetition. But if you look at the red, here is our imagery. So I can just feel how hot it must be. Hot days, hot days. I can hear the bugs buzzing and see them buzzing. I can hear the birds peeping, and he repeats the hot days, so it must be really hot in the summer where he's writing about. So those are some examples of imagery. Authors also use figurative language in their writing in poetry. So poets and other writers use figurative language to make their writing more interesting and expressive. So let's look at some examples of figurative language they might use in their poems. This one might be my favorite, onomatopoeias. So these are sound words, or words that imitate a sound, like buzz or zap or pow. So here's an example from Silverstein, of course. It's called The Fourth. Let's see if you can see some of the onomatopoeias he uses here. Oh, crash, my bash. It's bang, the zang. Fourth, whoosh, of Baroom, July. Whew. So he uses lots of onomatopoeias here, and I think he wants the reader to really understand what the 4th of July is like. The sounds that you hear, like crash and bash and bang and zang and whoosh. So these are the sounds that firecrackers might make on the 4th of July. So onomatopoeias are one type of figurative language that they might use. All right, alliteration is another type of figurative language that can be used. Alliteration is when almost all of the words in the lines have the same beginning sounds. So this poem right here has a lot of alliteration. So I want to see if you can figure out what sound or what letter sound keeps repeating. Winter from a Window by Robert Arthur Miller. With windows we watch winters with spring winds, while we wear whatever's warm, while we wait, we wonder whether weather will slow. With what was the worst winter storm? Where we were, within warming walls, we watched winter's weather wind down. Without windows, we wouldn't see what was winter's, whitest snow on the ground. Whew, that was a tongue twister. So, I hope you heard all of the W sounds in that poem by Robert Miller. So that's called alliteration. Now, alliteration doesn't always have to be in every line of the poem. Sometimes the author may just put alliteration in one line or two lines or just in one stanza. But this is an example where they used it throughout the poem. Similes are another type of figurative language authors like to use in poetry. This is where we compare two objects using like or as. And here's an example from Nicole M. O'Neill. It's called A Family is Like a Circle. A family is like a circle. The connection never ends. And even if at times it breaks, in times it always mends. So if you'll notice, I have the simile highlighted here in red. A family is like a circle. A family is not really a circle, but he's comparing the family to a circle by saying that it never ends. Their connection never ends of being part of a family. So there's an example of a simile in poetry. Metaphors can also be used in poems. A metaphor compares two objects just like a simile, but you do not use the words like or as. Here's an example from Langston Hughes in his poem Dreams. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. So in this poem, he's comparing your life to a broken winged bird or a barren field. So he's saying or making the point that if you don't have dreams or you don't continue trying to reach your dreams, your life is barren or kind of empty or maybe even broken like a bird's wing. So those are two examples of metaphors that were used there. All right, so we have an example here of a poem by Robert Frost, who's one of my other favorite poets. And I'm going to read it to you. And I want you to see if you can think back to all the characteristics we talked about: stanzas and lines and rhyming and imagery and repetition and free verse and figurative language, and see if you can find some of these characteristics in this poem by Robert Frost. So I'm going to read the poem, and then if you want to pause the video to see if you can list some of the characteristics you see, that would be awesome. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So pause the video and see if you can find some of the characteristics of poetry in this poem by Robert Frost. If you said there were 4 stanzas in this poem, you are correct. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Notice there's 4 lines and then a space, 4 lines and a space, and they do that 4 times. So that's 4 stanzas, 4 lines in each stanza. If you said that this poem had rhyme, you're also correct. In each stanza, the first, second, and the fourth lines rhyme. For example, in the first stanza, he says no, though, and snow. So this is not a free verse poem. This is a rhyming poem. This poem also has repetition. If you look at the last 2 lines, he says, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So I think he's trying to make a point that he's got a long way to go to get home. If you said this poem had imagery, it definitely does. He's describing the lovely, dark, deep woods. I can hear his horse's bell shaking around his neck. I can see the snow falling with an easy wind and downy flake. It's the darkest evening of the year. So there's lots of imagery in this poem as well. So I hope you were able to learn about some characteristics of poetry today. And I also hope that you are inspired to go read poetry because it's definitely a different type of writing. It's very special and has lots of different characteristics than some of the regular things that you read. I also hope that you can use some of these characteristics to write your own poem. You never know, you may be a poet yourself.